News of the times. Accident or murder. The death of Mary Cremen, Crosby, in 1882. Crosby, near Liverpool, 1882. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in 1882, in the seaside village of Crosby, a single gunshot shattered the calm. Within seconds, a young maid lay dead on the scullery floor, and her employer, 28-year-old Arthur Golding, was already walking to the police station, revolver still warm in his hand. He told officers it was an accident, a tragic mistake, a moment of carelessness with a gun he claimed he never meant to fire. But as investigators stepped into the Golding household, a very different picture began to emerge. One of jealousies, secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, and a marriage quietly collapsing behind closed doors. And then came the question no one could answer. How does a revolver loaded that very morning accidentally discharge at point-blank range? Over the next few days, the inquest would reveal a tangle of relationships so astonishing that the Victorian press struggled to believe it. Neighbours testified about clandestine visits. A 16-year-old boy made a confession that shocked the courtroom, and the dead maid, Mary Cremen, was suddenly at the centre of a scandal she could no longer speak to. Was this the careless mishandling of a firearm, or the moment a man decided that someone knew too much? Today, we uncover the forensic puzzle at the heart of the Crosby tragedy, a case that captivated Liverpool, divided a jury, and left a lingering question that remains unanswered more than a century later. And in our further particulars today, we turn to a rather hopeful widow of 1882 who attempted something truly ambitious, arranging life insurance for her husband several days after he had passed on. Victorian optimism, it seems, knew no bounds. In 1882, Crosby was a tidy, respectable corner of the Liverpool suburbs, a place of neat terraces, clipped hedges, and families who prided themselves on maintaining the appearance of quiet domestic order. It was a sort of neighbourhood where the Sunday promenade was observed with almost religious devotion, where the maid's apron was expected to be spotless, and where a raised voice behind closed curtains was enough to set tongues wagging for a fortnight. Middle-class respectability was the currency of the day. A gentleman kept his temper, a wife kept her composure, servants were to be dutiful and invisible, and whatever difficulties a family faced, emotional, financial, or moral, they were expected to remain firmly indoors. Yet, beneath this polished facade, the era was riddled with contradictions. The Victorians prized restraint, but were endlessly fascinated by scandal. They spoke earnestly of moral principles, while quietly tolerating the very behaviour those principles forbade. And nowhere were these tensions more visible than in a comfortable household about to be thrust into the public eye. The domestic web. Before we step into the scullery on that fateful afternoon, we must understand the domestic web in which this tragedy was spun. At the centre was Arthur Golding, 28, a clerk of respectable appearance, living at 11 Queen's Road with his wife, their 2 children, and their maid, 20-year-old Mary Cremen. Across the garden wall lived the Ritson brothers, William, 28, often seen in the company of Mrs. Golding, Foster, 16, whose involvement would astonish a courtroom. The Golding marriage, on its surface, appeared respectable, and in reality it was far less orderly. Mr. Golding was conducting an affair with Mary, the maid. Mrs. Golding was conducting an affair with William, apparently with her husband's blessing. What Mr. Golding did not know was that she was also seeing William's 16-year-old brother, Foster, a discovery that would enrage him. Mary, meanwhile, served as a confidant to Mrs. Golding while possibly engaging in an affair with Mr. Golding herself. By early summer, Mrs. Golding was pregnant, a thought by which Ritson brother no one could say. Mary, privy to every whisper, held all the threads of this tangled arrangement, and as she began walking out with a new admirer, Richardson, Mr. Golding's pride appeared to have been pricked in ways he did not care to admit. Jealousy, humiliation, and suspicion gathered like a storm cloud over Queen's Road. Convinced the Ritsons meant him harm, Mr. Golding began to carry a loaded revolver, declaring darkly that any trespass upon his property would be met with force. It was a combustible domestic arrangement by any measure, and on the 11th of June 1882, the spark finally landed. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 12th of June 1882, shocking tragedy at Crosby. A servant girl shot dead. Crosby, a pretty village on the northern suburbs of Liverpool, was yesterday afternoon thrown into a state of intense excitement. Its cause was the shooting, whether accidental or intentional cannot at present be ascertained, of a young woman named Mary Cremen, aged 20, by Mr. Arthur Golding, a well-known Liverpool estate agent in whose services she was. Golding and the girl were alone in the cellar kitchen at his residence, Queen's Road, when a report of firearms and a scream were heard. Golding's wife, running to ascertain the cause, met him on the stairs, and he said, "I have shot the servant." He immediately gave himself up at the Crosby police station and, it is said, made a statement to the officer in charge, which the police declined to give till today. Golding was locked up. The police on going into the house found the girl, whose friends live in Liverpool, lying on the floor dead, with a bullet wound in her forehead and the brains scattered. Death appeared to have been instantaneous. A 6-chambered revolver with 5 barrels loaded and one recently discharged was found on Golding, who will be brought before the county magistrates today. The police are busy investigating the circumstances of the case. Further inquiries show that Mary Cremen, the domestic, was in the scullery cleaning her master's boots. Mrs. Golding was upstairs, but the accused man was apparently impatient to go out and was waiting at the door of the scullery for his boots to be finished. The whole of what occurred may not be fully known, but the girl seems to have remarked to her master that his boots, which had been recently repaired, were very heavy, and he replied, "They do to kick somebody with." The deceased girl seemed to understand the allusion, for she replied, "What would you do if they should shoot you?" Golding pulled out of his pocket a 6-chambered revolver and laid his hand on the trigger. A report was heard, which startled Mrs. Golding, who, running down the stairs, met her husband coming up, pale and trembling with excitement, the smoking revolver in his hand. "I've shot Mary," was his reply to her hurried interrogation. Mrs. Golding ran back horrified to her bedroom, and Golding, leaving the girl lying dead on the floor of the scullery, went to the police station and gave himself up. He protests that the occurrence was accidental, and the version given above will probably be that alleged in his defence. Although on the surface the case seemed nothing more than a terrible accident, the police investigation quickly suggested otherwise. As officers began to speak with neighbours examining the revolver and piece together the final movements in the scullery, A series of questions arose, questions that troubled even the most measured minds in Crosby. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 13th of June 1882, the great Crosby tragedy. The prisoner before the magistrates. The shocking shooting case in Crosby village remains to a great extent involved in mystery. It has naturally caused intense excitement and forms a constant topic of conversation in the district. The accused, Arthur Golding, was well known in the locality, having resided for several years in Queen's Road, where he owned property. He had been misdescribed as an estate agent, the fact being that he merely occupied the position of a clerk to his brother who carried on that business. The deceased, Mary Cremen, had been in his service about 12 months, and it is described that she is a respectable young woman about 20 years of age. She was of Irish parentage, and her mother and stepfather at present reside in Lamport Street off Warwick Street in Liverpool. Arthur Golding was brought before the magistrates for the first review of the case, and now the prosecution had reason to question his account. A remark Golding made while in custody hints at possible deeper motives and suggests that the shooting may not have been the simple accident he first claimed. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 13th of June 1882, the prisoner before the magistrates. Arthur Golding was now brought before the magistrates, where the prosecution laid out the early facts of the case. They produced a revolver loaded in 5 chambers, the 6th recently discharged, and read aloud the statement Golding had made at the police station. I was standing at the scullery conversing with my servant Mary Cremen, waiting for my shoes to be cleaned, when she said to me, "What would you do if they went to shoot you first?" I put my hand into my pocket and pulled out my revolver, which I'd purchased and which I had a license to carry for self-protection from my next door neighbour, and presenting it toward her, not thinking at the time that it was loaded, I raised the hammer and fired, killing her on the spot. I immediately went upstairs and told my wife that I'd shot Mary and that she was dead. It was quite an accident, as I would not have laid my hands upon her for anything at all. The sergeant confirmed that Golding surrendered himself voluntarily, appearing shaken but coherent. He repeated that the shooting was accidental. But soon the prosecution revealed something new. Golding had made a second statement, one considered very important and believed to offer a possible motive. Its contents were not yet disclosed. They also challenged Golding's account of the revolver. Evidence suggested the weapon had been loaded that very morning, allegedly to shoot a dog, and that when fired it must have been either at half cock, requiring force to discharge, or at full cock, intentionally set. Of what actually took place in the cellar scullery, there was no living witness but the prisoner. It was the central difficulty of the case. Only Arthur Golding knew what had happened in the scullery, and his story was already beginning to shift. The gun. The revolver Golding carried was a typical Victorian six-shooter. Like most weapons of its kind, it had 2 distinct hammer positions, half cock and full cock. Understanding the difference between them became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments. At half cock, the hammer sits part way back. This position was effectively a safety setting. The trigger is disconnected, and the weapon should not fire unless it is handled with considerable force or mishandled in a very specific way. An accidental discharge from half-cock is possible, but extremely unlikely. At full cock, however, the revolver is fully primed. The hammer has been drawn all the way back, a deliberate action, and in this position The lightest pressure on the trigger will fire the weapon. A revolver does not reach full cock on its own. Someone must consciously set it there. And this was the heart of the prosecution's concern. If the weapon was at half cock when Golding must have exerted far more force than his story suggested. If it was at full cock, then he himself had prepared the gun to fire, something entirely inconsistent with the moment of carelessness and the conversation in the scullery. In either case, the mechanics of the revolver made Golding's claim of an instantaneous accident increasingly difficult to accept. The weapon could not discharge without a meaningful action, whether deliberate or reckless, and this technical point would become central to the magistrate's examination of the case. The inquest now began. The formal inquiry held to establish the facts of the case, determine the cause of death, and consider whether anyone might be held responsible for it. Initial public interest was modest, understandable given that the case still appeared to be a tragic household mishap. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 14th of June 1882, the inquest. The inquest on the body of Mary Cremen, the victim of the great Crosby tragedy, was opened yesterday afternoon at Morley's Hotel in Crosby before Mr. F. W. Barker, Deputy County Coroner. The coroner addressed the jury, stating, "Your duties today are, I need scarcely say, of a very painful nature and involve considerable responsibility. You are summoned to inquire into the cause of death of a young woman called Mary Cremen, who, I understand, was a domestic servant in the employment of Mr. Golding in this village. It seems that the deceased girl was engaged in some duty on Sunday afternoon. Mr. Golding, her employer, who is in custody before you, went to her and waited while she cleaned his boots. Some conversation ensued, but for some reason or other, and it is for you to say what the motive was, if there was a motive, the prisoner put his hands into what is called the hip pocket of his trousers and produced a revolver, presented it at the unfortunate girl and pulled the trigger, and shot her dead on the spot. Those are the short facts. Mary McGowan, who was the first witness, said the deceased Mary Cremen was her daughter by her first husband, who was a tailor in Cork. The young woman was 20 years of age, and she had been nearly 12 months in the employment of the accused at his residence at 11 Queen's Road, Crosby. Witness last saw her alive about 5 or 6 weeks ago. She was then in good health and spirits and seemed to be comfortable in her situation. Sergeant Shepherd next gave evidence. He confirmed that Golding had repeated his original account at the police station, the same version already presented to the magistrate, that he was waiting for his boots to be cleaned, produced the revolver and fired without thinking it was loaded. Golding stated it was purely accidental, but I must reserve my defence. The sergeant then described finding Mary lying in a pool of blood on the scullery floor, still warm, with part of the bullet wound visible. But one point of his testimony raised eyebrows. There was no sign whatsoever that any boot cleaning had been taking place. No blacking brush, no blacking, no cloths, and no boots positioned for cleaning. Nothing to support Golding's claim that he had been waiting for Mary to finish the task he said she was performing at the moment he drew the revolver. This discrepancy would become an early crack in Golding's version of events. Superintendent Walsh, who was the next witness, stated that about 3:15 on Sunday afternoon he visited the police station at Crosby and saw the accused in one of the cells. In charge of a constable, Golding addressed him and said, "Are you connected with the police?" He replied in the affirmative, and Golding then said, "I wish I'd never seen a revolver. I brought it on account of two neighbours named Ritson to defend myself. My wife is in the family way by one of them, and my servant knew for 3 months and kept it from me. I loaded the revolver this morning." Witness then said to the prisoner, "Stop. You're very excited. I must advise you, as this is a serious matter, that what you say will be given in evidence." The accused then exclaimed, "Oh, to think that she would die at my hands. It's all through those Ritsons. She gave evidence of my wife's adultery before my solicitors, Goffey and North." Superintendent Walsh continued his evidence. Among Mary's belongings he found a small box containing 7 letters, 3 written by Mrs. Golding and 4 signed by Arthur Golding himself. Their contents was not yet read to the jury, but the prosecution stated that they bore strongly upon the matter. Mr. Rowlands then gave his medical evidence, in which he described how he found a small perforating wound about the size of a pea near the orbit of the eye. The wound penetrated the skull and entered the cranial cavity. The bullet had entered the substance of her brain, which was lacerated in its most vital parts. The injury would have caused instant death. This confirmed that Mary died immediately, where she fell into the scullery. The inquest adjourned for the day, but when it resumed, the tone shifted noticeably. New testimony emerged, unexpected, personal, and far more revealing, and the case began to move beyond the appearance of a simple domestic tragedy. One detail that attracted particular attention was evidence suggesting that Golding had shown an interest in carrying a revolver some months before the shooting. Sergeant Shepherd stated that shortly after Christmas, Golding had asked what licence was required to carry such a weapon. He was told that a gun licence would be necessary, although the sergeant had not previously seen a revolver in Golding's possession. He understood that Golding had been in the habit of carrying one. This suggested that Golding's decision to arm himself was not recent, nor solely a reaction to his disputes with the Ritson family, but something he might have been considering for some time. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 21st of June 1882, the tragedy at Crosby. Adjourned inquest. William Ritson, merchant's clerk of 9 Queen's Road, Crosby, was the next witness. He stated that he knew the deceased Mary Cremen and became acquainted with her at Mr. Golding's house about September last. From September to the 28th of March, witness frequently visited the accused. On most of her visits, he saw the deceased. He generally sat in the dining room with Mr. and Mrs. Golding, and the deceased was often in the room. When he latterly visited the house, the deceased seemed to be treated as one of the family. Ritson was questioned about the nature of the relations between Golding and the deceased. He stated that he had observed a degree of familiarity between them which was not customary between master and servant. On several occasions when he had been visiting the house, the deceased had left the room followed by Golding, who sometimes turned the gas low before they withdrew. The two would remain absent for some time. When asked to describe the familiarity he had witnessed, Ritson said, "It was not such a conduct as you would expect from a master toward a servant." He added that he had seen them sitting together on the sofa, and on other occasions lying on the same sofa, even while he and Mrs. Golding were present. Some questions were put to Ritson about his friendship with the deceased, including letters addressed to her in his handwriting. He said these notes were written at Mrs. Golding's request and referred to previous arrangements. He denied any improper conduct. Ritson further stated that during the last 3 months of his own visits, his younger brother had also been going to the house, though not at the same time as himself. The deceased was aware of these visits. He also acknowledged knowing a man named Richardson who had recently been keeping company with the deceased. He confirmed that his acquaintance with Golding had ended on the 28th of March and that they had not spoken since. Foster Ritson, broker's clerk, living in the same house as the last witness, said he had known the deceased since Christmas last. About midnight on Christmas Eve, he went with Mrs. Golding, the deceased, and his younger brother in a cab with the intention of visiting the Roman Catholic chapel at Little Crosby and attending the midnight service. They alighted at the chapel, but did not enter, believing it would be full, and they all returned home together. After that occasion, his visits to Golding's house was frequent, and they took place sometimes at night and sometimes in the morning. Foster Ritson stated that his visit to the Golding household, particularly at night, were made without Mr. Golding's knowledge, and that during this period another young man had also been calling at the house for a short time in early March, his attentions being directed towards the deceased. He said his own visits were made at the request of Mrs. Golding and the deceased, and that these invitations were often repeated and were sometimes given in writing. His acquaintance with the family ended on the 28th of March when an incident occurred at the Golding residence. On that night, while he was in the dining room with Mrs. Golding and the deceased, Golding unexpectedly entered the house using a skeleton key, according to the witness. Golding came into the room without his shoes, carrying a stick, and in an excited manner declared, "I cry divorce from my wife from this day." He then shut the door, locked it, and placed the key in his pocket. Ritson added that Golding subsequently produced a revolver from his pocket, the trigger catching in the lining as he drew it out. Ritson confirmed that after this incident on the 28th of March, he had neither spoken to nor acknowledged Golding, although their relations had previously been amicable. Frederick William Richardson, joiner, from Beach Cottage, Victoria Road in Crosby, said he had known the deceased for 12 months. He went to visit her at Mr. Golding's house in the early part of this year, and on one occasion he stopped there all night. He did not think that Mr. Golding knew of his visits, for he took care to ascertain that the accused was not there before he went. In February, the prisoner saw him speaking to the deceased in the street, and he complained to the witness's father about it. On the following day, he saw Mr. Golding, whom then remarked that he had a good servant and wanted to keep her, and that the witness must either cease to go with her or she must leave his employment. And it was after that that the witness stayed all night in the house. 2 letters written by Golding to the deceased were then produced, both dated shortly after the incident on the 28th of March. In them, Golding arranged meetings with her away from the house and referred to recent domestic trouble, remarking that matters were all over and that he was the worst sufferer. The contents added little beyond showing that Golding and the deceased had continued to correspond privately in the days following the disturbances in the household. The jury, after 20 minutes consultation, returned a verdict of manslaughter against the accused, Arthur Golding, who was committed to the Liverpool Assizes for trial on the coroner's warrant. The prisoner, who said he had no statement to make, was then removed. With the verdict of manslaughter returned, Arthur Golding was committed to stand trial at the Liverpool Assizes. The inquest had already revealed an unusually tangled domestic situation, marked by secrecy, jealousy, and concealed relationships, yet none of it had resolved the central question, whether the shooting of Mary Cremen had been accidental, as Golding claimed, or the result of deliberate action. The Assizes would now examine the case afresh. Witnesses were recalled, the household's private affairs were again brought into public view, and Golding's conduct in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy came under closer scrutiny. The prosecution sought to establish that Golding had armed himself deliberately and acted with knowledge of the revolver's condition. The defence maintained that the fatal discharge had been nothing more than a tragic mishap in a moment of agitation. What followed was a sequence of revelations the Victorian press found both shocking and irresistible. From the Leeds Times, the 5th of August, 1882, the Crosby shooting tragedy, disgraceful revelations. At the Liverpool Assizes on Wednesday, Arthur Golding, 28, an estate agent, was indicted for the wilful murder of Mary Cremen at Great Crosby near Liverpool on the 11th of June last. Mr. Laresh, in stating the case for the prosecution, said the deceased was a young woman who lived in the same house as the prisoner, ostensibly as a domestic servant. The prisoner and his wife had 2 young children, but they were not at home, and the only inmates of the house were the married couple and the deceased girl. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Sunday the 11th of June, the prisoner went to the Crosby police station and made a statement to the effect that he was talking to the deceased while waiting for his boots to be cleaned, and that he was showing her a revolver, and that, not knowing it was loaded, he pointed it at her and pulled the trigger and shot her dead on the spot. The police, on going to the house, found the girl lying dead on the scullery floor with a bullet in her brain. Subsequently, the prisoner made another statement to the effect that he had loaded the revolver that morning and that he had purchased it on account of the 2 neighbours named Ritson. He went on to say, "My wife is in the family way by one of them, and my servant knew it and did not tell me of it, and she gave evidence of my wife's adultery before the solicitors." The police, on inquiring into the affair, made various discoveries as to the relations which existed between the prisoner and the deceased girl and the wife. These relations at the beginning of the year were of extraordinary character, for it would appear that familiarities existed between the prisoner's wife and a young man named William Ritson, and these were by no means unknown to the prisoner. Then the deceased girl was ostensibly the prisoner's servant, was living in the house under circumstances of familiarity with the prisoner which would suggest that she was his mistress. Familiarities took place between the deceased, the maid Mary Cremen, and the prisoner Arthur Golding in the presence of his wife, and familiarities took place between Ritson and the prisoner's wife, Mrs. Golding, in the presence of the prisoner Arthur Golding and the deceased girl Mary Clements. That state of things continued for some time, until a brother of Ritson's named Foster Ritson attracted the notice of Mrs. Golding, and an intrigue sprang up between them. The prisoner became exceedingly angry with Foster, and one evening he found Foster with his wife and Mary Cremen in the parlour, and he made a charge of adultery against his wife and Foster, and subsequently he consulted a solicitor about getting a divorce. Later on, however, he seemed to have dropped the matter, and Mrs. Golding went to visit some of her friends, leaving the prisoner, Arthur Golding, and the deceased Mary Cremen in the house. About this time, the prisoner appeared to have become aware that a young man named Richardson had commenced to go walking with Mary Cremen, and on one occasion he stayed all night with her. The prisoner, Arthur Golding, became very angry about it, and when he saw Richardson on one occasion, he produced a revolver and was very much excited. Evidence as to these facts having been given, William Ritson was called and spoke to his visiting the prisoner and his wife. They were very friendly. On one occasion, Golding left him in the room with Mrs. Golding and turned the gas down, and he stated that Golding told him that he might have his wife, but he would go with Mary. In cross-examination by Mr. Aspinall, William Ritson declined to say whether or not he had committed adultery with Mrs. Golding. He thought the question was irrelevant. William Ritson continued that it would be about February that he first heard that Mrs. Golding was committing adultery with his brother Foster. It was not, however, with his consent. Foster Ritson was next called and stated that he frequently visited Mrs. Golding at her request, and unknown to Golding, and that Mary Clements was brought messages from Mrs. Golding to him. And on the 28th of March last, Foster Ritson stated that he was in the Golding house with Mrs. Golding and the maid Mary when Golding burst into the room and attempted to draw a revolver on him, but he pacified him. Foster Ritson never went to the house again. In cross-examination, Foster Ritson admitted that he had often committed adultery with Mrs. Golding since last Christmas. He suspected that his brother was doing the same, but he did not actually know it. Mrs. Golding was in the habit of writing to him, and some of these letters were of a filthy description. The defence. The defence was that the affair was an unfortunate accident, for which Golding could not be held responsible except so far as he had been recklessly careful in the use of firearms. The judge, I'm going to start over again. The defence was that the affair was an unfortunate accident for which Golding could not be held responsible except so far as he had been recklessly careless in the use of firearms. The judge, in summing up, directed the jury that unless they were conscientiously convinced that it was an accident, they must find him guilty of murder. The jury found the prisoner guilty of manslaughter with a recommendation to mercy. The newspapers were quick to seize upon the case. That such conduct had been concealed within a well-regarded middle-class household astonished many readers, and the story soon travelled beyond the Liverpool district. Within days, it was being reported in papers across the country. Golding was found guilty of manslaughter by a jury, but his sentencing would be determined by a judge. From the Leeds Times, the 12th of August, 1882, the shooting tragedy at Crosby, sentence on Golding. Arthur Golding, who was convicted last week of the manslaughter of his servant girl Mary Cremen by shooting her at Great Crosby, was brought up for sentencing at the Liverpool Assizes on Saturday. The prisoner, when asked if he had anything to say, replied, "It was a pure accident, as I have said from the first." Mr. Justice Brett said the jury had found the prisoner guilty of manslaughter with a recommendation to mercy, to which he would have been strongly disposed independently of that recommendation. The death of Mary Cremen was caused no doubt by misfortune, but it was done in the course of the handling by the prisoner of a very dangerous implement that he was carrying about for the express purpose of using unlawfully against the Ritsons. His lordship strongly sympathised with the prisoner and felt that he had very great cause for provocation against those scoundrels, but at the same time there was nothing that could justify his taking the law into his own hands by carrying a pistol to use against them. It was a fortunate thing for the prisoner that it did not happen to meet them when he had the pistol about him. His lordship thought the prisoner guilty of culpable negligence, having had designs in his mind, not against the deceased, but unfortunately her death took place. He could not pass the matter over lightly, because the handling of such things as pistols was a very dangerous matter indeed, and a thing to be strongly condemned. But he could feel that he did not intentionally cause the death of Mary Cremen, and he had the satisfaction of being able to pass a comparatively light sentence, which was that the prisoner should be imprisoned for 4 months, which under the circumstances would be without hard labour. There was an attempt at applause in court, but it was quickly suppressed. The Crosby tragedy left behind a set of facts the court could not fully reconcile: a loaded revolver in a cramped scullery, a servant girl whose knowledge of the household far exceeded her station, and a husband whose anger had been simmering for months. The law concluded that Mary Cremen's death had not been intended, but had arisen from reckless handling of a weapon kept for purposes the judge himself condemned. Yet the verdict also reflected the Victorian view of domestic provocation, and the lenient sentence showed how deeply the jury and the court believed that the greater turbulence of the Golding household had steered events towards their fatal end. Mary's death remains the most tragic element of the case. A young woman caught in a web of loyalties, secrets and resentments not of her own making, and whose life ended in the instant of another's carelessness. Further particulars. And while the courts in 1882 were busy unravelling the jealousies and revolvers of Crosby, elsewhere in the country, a very different matter occupied the public mind, one involving neither passion nor gunpowder, but a remarkable piece of optimism. It concerned a widow who attempted something no jury could have foreseen, securing life assurance some days after her husband's death. From the Illustrated Police News, the 3rd of July, 1882, extraordinary insurance claim, a dead man seeks assurance. A proceeding of the most remarkable, indeed laughable description has lately come to light at an insurance office in the Strand, and has set the clerks, as one of the informant phrased it, fairly beside themselves with wonder. A certain tradesman of Clerkenwell, whose death occurred with lamentable suddenness some weeks since, had, during his lifetime, spoken frequently of insuring his life for the better support of his wife. He had procured the printed form, made sundry inquiries, and even laid the paper upon his desk with the manifest purpose of completing it. Death, however, intervened before either the premium or proposal had reached the office. Shortly after the funeral, the widow entered the establishment and solemnly demanded payment of the sum her husband had intended to insure. The clerk, believing the request to be some species of misunderstanding, ventured to inquire whether the deceased had submitted the necessary documents or paid the first premium. The widow replied that such trifles ought not to stand in the way of justice, her husband having been fully resolved to insure, and the company ought, therefore, to honour the deceased's intention. The manager to whom this singular application was referred exhibited commendable patience in explaining that a life cannot be insured after it has ceased to exist, nor could the company be expected to undertake liabilities which had never been contracted. The widow's, nothing daunted, pressed her claim with increased warmth, insisting that her husband's ultimate removal ought not to frustrate the very purpose for which the insurance was meant. The manager, in declining the demand, observed somewhat dryly that if such a principle was accepted, every man who departed this life might, by mere expression of intent, become the possessor of a handsome policy, a notion which, he remarked, would bring the entire system of assurance to a very speedy collapse. The application was accordingly dismissed, although not without furnishing the office with a topic of lively conversation, and it is said that the clerks have seldom encountered a case which has more thoroughly confounded their professional experience. And so another case closes. The church bell gives a faint judgmental bong, and the teapot informs me it is quite empty, always a sign we've reached the end. If you've enjoyed this wander through Victorian intrigue, do tap anything that looks vaguely positive. It helps more than you think. And if you'd like to access to the full hoard of hundreds of episodes, over 800 safely stashed away like a respectable dragon's treasure, you'll find them all on Patreon for the price of a rather unimpressive coffee, but far more satisfying. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time marmalade assessor, amateur lighthouse polisher, and self-appointed inspector of squeaky floorboards. See you next time on more foggy cobblestone streets.